You want me to what? Magnolia Thornwood's voice cracked like thunder through the ranch house as Jasper Coltrane, the wealthiest cattle baron in Wyoming Territory, stood before his giant mail-order bride holding a heavy winter coat, leather gloves, and a loaded rifle. The Philadelphia socialite, all 6 feet 2 inches of her trembling in her proper Eastern dress, stared at the frontier, custom no woman from back east could have ever imagined. Riding out into the pitch-black Wyoming night in blizzard conditions to check 2,000 head of cattle alongside her new husband. "Ladies don't go outside after dark," Maggie gasped, her face draining of color. But Jasper's jaw tightened as he met her shocked gaze. "Ranch wives do," he said quietly, his calloused hands still holding out the coat. "My first wife refused. She's buried on the hill behind the barn." The giant mail-order bride's hands shook as she looked from the heavy coat to the rich cowboy's weathered face, then out the frosted window where the wind howled like wolves. This wasn't the safe, comfortable marriage she'd fled Philadelphia's poverty to find. This was something else entirely, something dangerous, something that would require every ounce of the strength she'd spent her whole life hiding, because society called strong women unfeminine and unmarriageable. But what did Jasper Coltrane really see when he looked at his giant bride? Why had he specifically sent for the tallest, strongest woman the agency could find? And what really happened to his delicate first wife on that hill? Maggie had arrived at Coltrane Ranch just 3 hours earlier, her trunk still sitting unpacked in the bedroom that smelled of cedar and loneliness. The journey from Philadelphia had taken 2 weeks, 2 weeks of watching America transform from cobblestone streets to endless prairie, from gas lamps to star-filled darkness so complete it made her feel like she'd traveled to the edge of the world. She'd stepped off the train in Cheyenne, expecting her new husband to recoil at her height the way every man back east had done, expecting to see disappointment cloud his eyes when he realized the agency had sent him a woman who towered over most men. But Jasper Coltrane had simply nodded once, picked up her trunk like it weighed nothing, and said, "You're exactly what I asked for." Those words had stirred something dangerous in her chest. Hope. Now that hope felt like foolishness as she stood in this ranch house that seemed to swallow sound, staring at a man who expected her to ride into a blizzard like some kind of frontierswoman. "I can't," she whispered, and hated how small her voice sounded. "I've never even been on a horse after sunset. I don't know how to—" "I'll teach you," Jasper interrupted, but there was no warmth in his tone, just cold practicality. "Every night until spring. It's not optional, Magnolia. This ranch covers 15,000 acres. When a blizzard hits, cattle bunch up and suffocate each other. Newborn calves freeze to death in minutes. Wolves come down from the mountains. If we don't ride out together, animals die. If one of us gets thrown from a horse or lost in whiteout conditions, the other brings them home. That's how frontier marriages work." He stepped closer, and Maggie caught the scent of leather and wood smoke that clung to him. "My first wife, Delilah, was delicate, refined. She played piano and embroidered pillowcases and kept the house beautiful. But she couldn't survive out here. Not really. She got pregnant, and the nearest doctor was 40 miles away through snowdrifts. I rode for help, but by the time I got back..." His voice cracked just slightly. "I buried her and our son on that hill 3 years ago. I swore I'd never marry a woman who couldn't be my partner. Not just my wife. My partner." Maggie's heart hammered against her ribs. Back in Philadelphia, her uncle had called her freakishly large and mannish. The marriage agency had been her last option before complete destitution. She'd assumed any man desperate enough to order a bride wouldn't care about her size, but she'd never imagined one would want her because of it. "You ordered me," she said slowly, the realization dawning like cold sunrise. "Because I'm big enough to do this work." Jasper's eyes met hers, and for the first time since she'd arrived, She saw something other than business in his gaze, something that looked almost like respect. I ordered you because the frontier doesn't care about embroidery skills or piano playing. It cares about survival, and I need someone strong enough to survive it with me. Outside, the wind screamed louder. The window panes rattled. Somewhere in the darkness, cattle were already in danger. And Magnolia Thornwood had a choice to make that would determine not just whether she stayed on this ranch, but whether she would finally become the woman she'd always been too afraid to be. Maggie's fingers closed around the heavy coat, and the weight of it felt like accepting a verdict she couldn't appeal. The leather was cold, stiff from years of Wyoming winters, and when she pulled it on over her eastern dress, it swallowed her frame despite her size. Jasper handed her the gloves without a word, then the rifle, and she nearly dropped it because no one had ever handed her a weapon before. It's loaded, he said, watching her fumble with the unfamiliar weight. Safety's on. We might need it for wolves. Wolves. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Back in Philadelphia, the most dangerous thing Maggie had encountered was her uncle's cutting remarks at dinner parties. Now she was holding a gun and preparing to ride into darkness so complete she couldn't see her own hand in front of her face. But something stirred in her chest as she followed Jasper out into the brutal cold, something that felt dangerously like excitement. The wind hit her like a physical blow the moment she stepped off the porch. It stole her breath, drove needles of ice through every gap in her clothing, and made her eyes water instantly. She couldn't see more than 10 feet ahead. The world had vanished into swirling white chaos. "Stay close!" Jasper shouted over the howling storm, leading her toward the barn where 2 horses waited, already saddled. "If you lose sight of me, stop moving and fire the rifle twice. I'll find you." He swung onto his horse with the easy grace of someone who'd been riding since childhood. But when he looked back at Maggie struggling to mount her mare in her bulky dress and oversized coat, something shifted in his expression. He dismounted, came to her side, and without asking permission, he lifted her by the waist and set her in the saddle like she weighed nothing at all. For a moment, their faces were close enough that she could see the ice already forming in his dark beard, could feel his breath mixing with hers in the frigid air. "Don't be afraid of being strong out here," he said, and there was something fierce in his eyes. "Be afraid of being weak." Then he was back on his horse, and they were riding into the storm. The cold was unlike anything Maggie had ever experienced. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was violently, aggressively painful. It bit through her gloves and made her fingers ache. It froze the moisture in her nose and made every breath feel like swallowing glass. The wind pushed against her so hard she had to lean into it just to stay upright in the saddle, and she couldn't see anything, just white. Endless, disorienting white. But then Jasper's voice cut through the chaos. "There, see them?" And suddenly Maggie could make out dark shapes huddling together in the storm, hundreds of cattle packed so tight they looked like one massive breathing creature. They were bunching up exactly like Jasper had warned, the ones in the middle being slowly crushed by the weight of the herd. "We have to spread them out," Jasper shouted, already riding toward the mass of animals. "Drive them apart or they'll suffocate." For a split second, Maggie froze. Every instinct screamed at her to turn her horse around, ride back to the warm ranch house, admit she wasn't built for this brutal frontier life. But then she thought about Delilah buried on that hill, about how being delicate and refined had made that woman too fragile to survive, about how Maggie herself had spent 23 years making herself smaller, quieter, less visible because society told her that big women should apologize for taking up space. And something inside her snapped like a frozen branch. She dug her heels into her horse's flanks and charged toward the herd. The mare responded to her size, her weight, her strength. Things that had always been liabilities back east were suddenly advantages out here in this frozen hell. She drove her horse into the mass of cattle, shouting at the top of her lungs, using her body to push the animals apart. They scattered before her like she was a force of nature. Jasper appeared beside her, and she saw shock register on his face. Not disappointment, not pity. Shock that was edged with something that looked almost like pride. "That's it," he shouted. "Keep pushing." They worked together in the darkness, two figures battling against nature itself, spreading the herd until the cattle could breathe again. Maggie's arms ached. Her legs burned from gripping the horse. Her face felt like it might shatter from the cold. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Because for the first time in her entire life, someone needed her strength instead of being ashamed of it. Then she heard it, a sound that made her blood turn to ice water. A howl. Close. Too close. Jasper's head snapped toward the sound, and Maggie saw 3 pairs of eyes gleaming in the darkness just beyond the herd. Wolves. Big ones. And they were circling a cow that had separated from the group. A cow that Maggie could now see had just given birth. A tiny calf lay steaming in the snow, too new to even stand. "The rifle!" Jasper shouted. "Maggie, the rifle!" Her hands were shaking so hard she almost couldn't grip the weapon. She'd never fired a gun in her life, never even held one until tonight. But those wolves were moving toward that helpless calf, and the mother cow was too exhausted from labor to defend her baby. Maggie raised the rifle, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it over the wind, and she fired into the air. The gunshot cracked through the storm like the world splitting open, and for one breathless moment, everything stopped. The wolves froze mid-stalk, their yellow eyes locked on Maggie. The cattle shifted nervously. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then the largest wolf, a gray beast the size of a small pony, bared its teeth and took a step forward. Not away, forward, toward her. "Fire again!" Jasper was already charging toward her, his own rifle raised, but he was too far away, the distance between them swallowed by darkness and swirling snow. "Maggie, fire at it! Not in the air! At it!" But Maggie's hands wouldn't obey. The rifle felt impossibly heavy. She'd been taught her whole life that ladies didn't kill things, didn't raise their voices, didn't take up space or draw attention, or act like they had the right to protect anything. Every instinct screamed at her to wait for Jasper to save her, to be the delicate woman who needed rescuing. The wolf took another step, then another. Its pack mates flanked it, spreading out like they'd done this 1,000 times before. The newborn calf bleated, a tiny, helpless sound that cut through Maggie's paralysis like a knife. That sound, that small, defenseless cry for help that would go unanswered if she didn't act. And suddenly, she wasn't thinking about what ladies did or didn't do. She was thinking about that calf dying in the snow, about Delilah buried on the hill because she'd been too fragile for this world, about every time someone had told Maggie she was too much, too big, too strong, too loud, too everything. She lowered the rifle, aimed at the ground between her and the lead wolf, and fired. The bullet kicked up an explosion of snow and frozen earth just inches from the beast's paws. The wolf yelped and jumped back, its confidence shattered. Maggie worked the rifle's lever action like she'd seen Jasper do, chambering another round, and fired again. Closer this time. The wolves scattered, their nerve broken by this giant woman who refused to be prey. They vanished into the storm like smoke, and suddenly Jasper was beside her, his horse dancing nervously, his face a mixture of shock and something else she couldn't quite name. "You didn't kill them," he said, and she couldn't tell if it was an accusation or an observation. Maggie's whole body was shaking so hard she thought she might fall out of the saddle. "I didn't need to kill them," she managed through chattering teeth. "I just needed to make them afraid of me instead of the calf." For a long moment, Jasper just stared at her. Then something incredible happened. He smiled. Not the polite, practiced smile men gave women at Philadelphia dinner parties. A real smile that reached his eyes and transformed his weathered face into something almost boyish. "My first wife would have fainted," he said quietly. "Most women would have. Hell, most men would have." He dismounted and walked to where the newborn calf lay shivering beside its exhausted mother. The tiny creature was already trying to stand on legs that wouldn't quite hold its weight yet. "Help me," Jasper said, and Maggie realized he wasn't giving her an order. He was asking, requesting her partnership. She slid from her horse, her legs nearly giving out when her feet hit the frozen ground, and stumbled to where Jasper knelt beside the calf. "We need to get them both back to the barn," he explained, his hands already working to lift the calf. "The mother will follow if we carry her baby, but newborns are heavier than they look, and I can't carry the calf and control my horse in this wind." He looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw a question he was almost afraid to ask. "Can you carry it?" Maggie looked down at the calf. It was maybe 60 pounds of gangly legs and huge eyes, shivering violently in the brutal cold. Back east, she'd never been allowed to carry anything heavier than a teacup because ladies didn't do manual labor. But out here in this frozen wilderness, a life depended on her strength. She bent down, wrapped her arms around the calf, and lifted. It was heavy. So heavy her back immediately protested and her arms burned. But she held on. The calf's mother lowed anxiously and pressed close to Maggie, her huge body providing a windbreak as they began the long walk back to the barn. Jasper led both horses with one hand and used the other to steady Maggie when she stumbled. They moved through the storm like survivors of a shipwreck, 3 humans and 3 animals bound together by nothing but the desperate need to make it home alive. Maggie's arms screamed with pain. Her back felt like it might snap. The cold had gone past, painful, into a numb absence of all sensation. But she didn't drop the calf. She thought about every time someone had called her unwomanly, every time she'd hunched her shoulders trying to appear smaller, every time she'd apologized for existing in a body that didn't fit what society wanted women to be. And she held on tighter. When the barn finally emerged from the darkness, like a miracle made of wood and lamplight, Maggie's knees buckled and she nearly collapsed. But Jasper was there, taking the calf from her arms, guiding her inside where the air felt impossibly warm, even though it was barely above freezing. She sank onto a hay bale, her entire body trembling, watching as Jasper expertly settled the calf and its mother in a clean stall with fresh hay and water. Her hands were so cold she couldn't feel her fingers. Her face felt frozen in a permanent grimace. But when Jasper turned to look at her, she saw something in his expression that made her forget the cold entirely. "You saved that calf's life tonight," he said simply. "And probably mine too. I've never seen anyone face down a wolf pack on their first night on the frontier." He crouched in front of her, and slowly, carefully, he pulled off her frozen gloves and wrapped her hands in his own. His palms were rough with calluses, scarred from years of ranch work, but they were warm, so warm. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I need to tell you something," Jasper said quietly, his calloused hands still wrapped around Maggie's frozen fingers, warming them with a gentleness that seemed impossible from a man who'd just battled a Wyoming blizzard. "About why I really sent for you. About what really happened to Delilah." Maggie's breath caught in her throat. The barn was silent except for the soft sounds of the calf nursing and the wind howling outside like a creature that wanted to devour them all. "When I married Delilah," Jasper continued, his voice rough with old pain, "I thought I was doing everything right. She was beautiful, refined, everything a man was supposed to want in a wife. But I was so busy trying to protect her from the hardness of this life that I made her a prisoner. I wouldn't let her help with the ranch work. wouldn't let her ride out with me. Kept her in that house like she was made of glass. His jaw tightened, and Maggie saw moisture gathering in his eyes. She got lonely, so lonely she stopped eating, stopped talking. When she got pregnant, I thought it would save her, give her something to love, something to live for. But the pregnancy was hard, and when her time came during a blizzard just like tonight, I had to choose between staying with her or riding for the doctor. I chose to ride for help. He stopped, his voice breaking. By the time I got back with the doctor, she'd been hemorrhaging for hours. Our son was already gone. She looked at me. And you know what her last words were? Maggie shook her head, tears streaming down her frozen cheeks. She said, "I wish you'd let me be strong enough to help you." Then she died in my arms. And I realized I'd killed her by trying to protect her. I'd made her so weak, so isolated, that when she needed strength most, she had nothing left. Jasper's hands tightened around Maggie's. I swore on her grave that if I ever married again, it would be to a woman who could be my true partner. Not someone I had to protect from reality, someone strong enough to face it with me. When I wrote to that agency, I told them exactly what I needed, the strongest, tallest woman they had. Someone the world had probably told 1,000 times she was too much. Because out here, Maggie, there's no such thing as too much. Out here, strong women don't survive. In spite of their strength, they survive because of it. Fresh tears poured down Maggie's face, but these weren't tears of cold or fear. They were tears of something breaking open inside her chest, some cage she'd been living in her whole life, finally cracking apart. Back in Philadelphia, she whispered, "My uncle used to make me eat dinner in the kitchen with the servants because he said my size embarrassed him in front of guests. He said no real man would ever want a woman who could look him in the eye, that I should be grateful anyone was willing to tolerate me." Jasper's face darkened with anger. "Your uncle was a fool and a coward." He stood, pulling Maggie to her feet, and even though she was 6 feet 2 inches tall, even though she'd spent her whole life being the biggest woman in every room, Jasper looked at her like she was exactly the right size, like she'd been made perfectly for this moment, this place, this life. "I need you to understand something," he said, his voice steady and sure. "Tonight, you rode into a blizzard you'd never experienced. You scattered a herd of cattle with nothing but courage. You faced down wolves to protect a creature that couldn't protect itself. You carried a 60-pound calf through a storm that would have broken most men. And you did all of it on your first night here. Your first night." He reached up and gently brushed a strand of frozen hair from her face. "I didn't order a mail-order bride, Maggie. I asked the agency to find me a partner, someone who could stand beside me, not behind me. And they sent me you, the woman I didn't even know I was looking for." Maggie's heart was hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. "I'm afraid," she admitted, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I'm afraid I'll fail, that I'll let you down, that I'm not actually as strong as you think I am." Jasper smiled, and it transformed his entire face. "Everyone's afraid out here. The difference is whether you let fear make you smaller or whether you let it make you fight harder. Tonight, you chose to fight. And that's all I need to know about who you are." He took her hand and led her to the barn door, pushing it open just enough to point toward the hill behind the ranch house, where a simple white cross stood stark against the swirling snow. "Delilah's up there," he said quietly, "and I think she'd be glad I finally found someone who could survive what she couldn't. Not because she was weak, she wasn't, but because this life demands a kind of strength she was never allowed to develop. A strength you already have." Maggie stared at that lonely cross and made a silent promise to the woman buried beneath it. A promise that her death wouldn't be meaningless, that Maggie would be the partner Jasper needed, that she would never apologize for being strong again. "What happens now?" she asked, turning back to face her husband. And the word husband suddenly meant something entirely different than it had 3 hours ago. Jasper's eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Now we go back to the house, we warm up, and tomorrow night we ride out again, and the night after that, and every night until spring comes, together, as partners, as equals. He paused, and something vulnerable flickered across his face. And maybe, if you'll have me, as something more than just a business arrangement. Maggie looked at this man who'd chosen her specifically because of the things everyone else had rejected her for, who'd seen her size as an asset instead of a flaw, who'd handed her a rifle and trusted her to protect what mattered, who'd asked for her help instead of trying to do everything alone. And for the first time in her 23 years of life, Magnolia Thornwood felt like she was exactly where she belonged. Yes, she whispered, and the word felt like stepping off a cliff into open air, terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Yes to all of it. Jasper pulled her close, and when he kissed her it tasted like snow and smoke and promises made in the dark. Like coming home to a place she'd never been before, but somehow always knew existed. Outside, the blizzard still raged. The frontier was still brutal and unforgiving. The work would still be backbreaking and dangerous. But Maggie wasn't afraid anymore, because she'd finally found a place where being strong wasn't something to apologize for, where taking up space wasn't a sin, where a giant woman and a lonely cowboy could build something real together in the frozen darkness. And as they walked back through the snow toward the ranch house, Maggie looked up at the endless Wyoming sky and smiled. Because she was exactly enough. She'd always been exactly enough. She just needed someone brave enough to see it. So tell me, where are you watching this from today? And here's something to think about. Have you ever hidden the strongest parts of yourself because you were afraid of being too much for the people around you? Drop your answer in the comments below. I'd love to hear your story.